And so today we will be talking a little bit about the experience of immigrants in the United States, and particularly the particular challenges that they represent for us as a church here in the United States. Before we jump in, I'd like to say a few things about myself. I was born in Huancayo, Peru, in the highlands of Peru. It's a city up in the mountains in a beautiful valley. I lived there until I was 12 years old, and I came to the U.S. back in 1994, and I've been in the U.S. ever since. So every time I go back to Peru, I am told by my family and relatives that I am no longer Peruvian. And so, because I've been acculturated to the U.S. and the way that we live here and the way that we speak and interact, everything about me has been vastly influenced by the culture of the United States. So I feel in many ways that, I'm neither from there nor here in some cases. And that's the experience of a lot of immigrants, that they feel that they neither belong here nor that they belong back at home anymore. And so that's a very common experience of immigrants. I've been married for 5 years, and I have two very beautiful kids. My daughter is 4 years old, and my son is 1. We live here in the Northern Virginia area, and we just, we enjoy going out for walks and just being with family and enjoying everything that has to offer. My educational background, I have a master's in Latin American Studies from Georgetown University, and I have a bachelor's in History and Pastoral Theology from Loyola Marymount. I've been working in ministry for many years, and I've been involved at the parish, diocesan, and national levels. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I currently serve as the Executive Director of the Office of Cultural Diversity and Outreach here in the Archdiocese of Washington. And one of the great things that I'm able to enjoy through this new job that I have, this work that I've been doing for the past 2 years, is the ability to interact with so many cultures, the ability to interact and work with immigrant communities who are trying to find a home. And in many cases, they've been established for many years. They've been communities that have been present in the life of our local church for many years, but they're still trying to find their place. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So today what we're going to do is we're going to use the Latin American model, or a model that the church in Latin America loves to use whenever they discuss an issue. And it's this methodology of the See, Judge, Act, ver, juzgar, y actuar. This methodology allows us to look at the current reality of what's happening. So we'll look at the reality of immigrants here in the United States. We'll look at some statistics. What are the challenges? What do they represent? What are the stories that they're coming with? And what does that mean for us? So we'll take a look at the reality. And then we'll move into the judge, which basically means that we will be reflecting on what the church tells us that we should be doing as it relates to the accompaniment of immigrants. We'll look at sacred scripture, we'll look at the teachings of papal teachings, and as well as Catholic social thought. And so we'll use that as a lens to judge the reality that we have seen. And once we do that, we'll be able to move to the third part of this methodology, which is the act. And basically, here we'll be looking at some of the responses that we need to enact, some of the things that we need to be doing in our parishes, in our Catholic institutions, wherever it is that we are. What are the opportunities, and how do we meet the needs of immigrants in our church? So that's what we'll be doing today. We'll see, we'll judge, and we'll act. So let's start by looking at the reality of immigrants. So let's, in the United States today, we have over 43 million immigrants. And this represents about, close to a little bit over 13% of the total population. And one of the things that we need to understand is, 43 million sounds like a big number. And certainly in numbers, it is a big number, and it's one of the highest, it's the highest numbers of immigrants that we've had in our history. However, when we look at the percentage of the population, it's remained pretty constant. The highest point, of the immigrant population was 15%, and that was back in the 1890s. So in the 1890s was when we had the highest percentage of immigrants in the United States. Um, so, so what we know, in what I'm showing here on this little graph, is the population, the immigrant population in the history of the United States beginning in the 1850s, when the Census Bureau started taking account of this. And so if you look at this graph, you'll see that up to the 1900s and the early 1900s, the immigrant rate, was above 10%. And right around the 1920s is when it begins, the percentage of immigrants begins to drop. And that coincides with the Great Depression in the 1930s and then the World War II. All those different things began to contribute to the drop of the numbers of immigrants in the United States. And then in the 1960s, and actually before the 1960s and the 1920s, it also coincides with some changes that Congress begins to enact on immigration policies. So they become a little more restrictive, and that also has an impact on the number of immigrants that come to this country. And then in 1965, there's another immigration law that is passed, and that has a radical change on the immigration patterns, because that allows for a larger number of people to begin to come to the United States. So it increases immigration, but it also diversifies the immigrants that we get. So largely before the 1960s, most of our immigrants were coming from Europe, Eastern Europe. And what happens in the 1960s and beyond, especially in the 1970s and beyond, is that we begin to see a different type of immigrant. And they're usually immigrants from Latin America and Asia. And I want to show you this other little map here. So this kind of paints the picture. If you look at the 1960s, you see the dark brown there at the top. That's the European immigrants. And then the other three at the bottom, the lower one are immigrants from Mexico. So if you look in the 1960s, the immigrants from Mexico didn't even represent 10% of the immigrants coming to the United States. The vast majority of immigrants came from Europe. We had some Latin America and some Asians. But you can see there, beginning in the 1970s, that number begins, the demographics there begin to change. Fewer and fewer Europeans come to the United States, and more Latin Americans and Asians begin to come to the United States. One may ask the question, well, why does this happen? Well, the economies in Europe begin to get better. So time after World War II, the economies are recovering, and they're really strong. So there are fewer and fewer Europeans who migrate to the United States. And what's happening in Latin America, and this is during the Cold War, as those in their history, if we go back to our history, the Cold War really starts pushing people out of, particularly from Latin America. We begin to see a lot of instability. We have a lot of repression, dictators coming up to power. So there's a huge power struggle. And there's increasing violence, and there's poverty and economic instability in different parts of the world. And those are the conditions that push people out of their homes. And that's one of the things that we need to understand as we're working with immigrants is the fact that they're leaving not because they want to leave their homes, but they're leaving because they have to leave their homes. And I think this map really, this graph really shows what happens, how the economics affect immigration. Because again, as you can see, once the economy starts doing a lot better in Europe, fewer and fewer people from Europe need to come and need to leave their countries. Whereas the opposite happens in other parts of the world, and so that begins to push people. But so now that we begin to see people from different parts, Latin America and Asia, then that means that we have Catholics who practice their religion differently. And so because of their culture, they began to express their Catholicism in very different ways, and ways that most European immigrants were not accustomed to or were not familiar with. And so those things began to represent some challenges. And what we also have right around this time in the 1970s and 80s, and especially in the 90s, is we began to see the end of the national parishes. And so what in previous generations would work as the vehicle to integrate immigrants into the U.S. society begins to disappear. So what we have today are shared parishes, where we have 2 or 3 cultural communities sharing one space. Whereas before you used to have the Italian parish, the Polish parish, and the German parish, probably all within a block, but they were serving different populations. And they were helping to integrate these populations into the U.S. culture. That doesn't happen anymore. Now we have one space with multiple cultures competing for space. And a lot of times, these cultures are not very familiar with each other. They have different values. They have different ways of expressing their faith. And so we begin to see some of the conflicts that we experience in our parishes today. Let's take a closer look. Here's another map, another chart that shows by region where immigrants are coming from. And you can see that the largest share of immigrants today into the United States come from Mexico. Approximately, close to 30% of the immigrants today in the United States are from Mexico. And then the second largest group are South and East Asian immigrants. So these are people from Vietnam, these are people from Korea, the Philippines, and that region. Europeans still account for about 13% of immigrants. And then you can see, where the other groups, Central America and South America, the percentages there. The pie chart right next to it shows you the number or the percentage of, among those immigrants, the percentage of those who are undocumented. So about 1 in 4 immigrants in the United States are undocumented. And mostly they are from Mexico and Central America. And so the challenges that these immigrants bring to us are very different than those immigrants who come from Africa and from other parts of Asia who might be documented and might have legal status. And we'll look into that a little bit. The other thing I wanted to show you is, this graph is a little confusing, but this is the distribution of age and sex of the immigrants. So on the one side, you have the native born. These are U.S. citizens. These are folks who were born in this country. That's the population distribution between males and females. And it looks sort of like a pyramid, right? So we have a lot of young people in our population, in our citizen population in the United States. And when you look at the immigrants, you kind of have this diamond shaped, right? So what this tells us is that the vast majority of immigrants are actually young people beginning in their 20s and going up to their 40s and 50s. That's the majority of people that we're receiving as immigrants, and it makes sense that we wouldn't have a lot of young people, under the age of 5 and below, because if they were coming, they're coming with their parents who are in higher in age. So when we look at the differences between our population and the immigrant population, we can see that the immigrant population is a young adult and an adult population. So these are young families, a lot of times young workers who are coming to the United States. And these are things that we have to be aware of because we have to know why they're coming. And this gives us an understanding that they're looking for opportunities, economic opportunities. They're fleeing persecution and violence in many cases, and they're looking for stability in their lives. And so they're leaving, they're uprooting, coming here, looking for that. So let me go to this next one. And this next graph, and I'll have a couple more graphs, and then I'll be done with the graphs, I promise. But this next graph shows us that approximately 49% of our immigrants, of the population of the 43 million immigrants, are age 5 or above. And when we look at, their limited English proficiency, what this means is that they don't speak English very well, right? But this also means that 50% have dominate the language. There's a myth among immigrants or among our culture actually about immigrants. One of the stereotypes that we have is, well, they come here and they don't learn the language. It's not necessarily true. And what we know about immigrants today is that they really follow the pattern of previous generations. So when we look back at the reality of national parishes, we have to remember that the reason why we established national parishes was because we had immigrants who were coming and needed space to worship in their own language within the context of their own culture. And so the grandparents and sometimes the parents, the immigrants, did not speak English or were not very fluent, so they needed the liturgy and the services in their own language. Once their children started coming of age, then they would incorporate it into the mainstream, as we would call it, U.S. culture. And so they would begin to go to the non-ethnic parishes, right? And the same thing happens with immigrants today. It's usually the grandparents and the parents who are learning English or who have a limited, limited English, but their children have become, fluent. And as a matter of fact, their first language is English. That's how they operate. Another myth that we often have about immigrants is that, especially today, given our current political climate, is that they're somehow uneducated. They're people who come here and they're working in the farms and factories, but they're not really people who are educated. And so, if you can see on this graph, you see that immigrants, they come with already a bachelor's and a master's, so they are educated, they are college educated, and what we know is that the percentage, 29% of immigrants over the age of 25 have a college education. And that's pretty much the average for the U.S. population. So immigrants are not less educated than our U.S. citizens. And then I'll end with this last graph, because I think I've thrown a lot of graphs at you today. But this graph shows that Catholics are more likely than any other American, any other religion, to be immigrants or children of immigrants. And so this means that our church is very much an immigrant church. And you can look at the first bar there, the first part of that graph shows you that among Catholics, we have 34% who are Hispanic, and then we have Asians represent about 3%, 3% Black, and then 59% white European, right? And then 2% other. And when you look at the general population, the numbers are different. So we, as a church, are more likely to have immigrants or to be immigrants and children of immigrants than the general population. And so that has a significant implication on who we are, because that's part of our identity. So being a church of immigrants, it's not just a nation of immigrants, but we are a church of immigrants. And so that has implications into how we do our ministry, how we do our outreach, and how we work and welcome our immigrant brothers and sisters. So when we continue to look at this, so let's look at what all these numbers represent. So what's the impact of these changing demographics, the fact that we have immigrants coming from different parts of the world? What is the impact on the Catholic Church? Well, so we know that the Catholic Church in the United States is one of the most culturally diverse institutions in the country, and will continue to become diverse as new waves of immigrants continue to come to this country. Our parishes, the schools and colleges, all the ministry that we do have to adapt and prepare for this growing diversity. So what does that mean? Well, let me give you an example. In the Archdiocese of Washington, we celebrate the Mass on Sundays in 22 languages. So this is just in one little part of the country, the Archdiocese of Washington. We celebrate Mass in 22 languages. Catholic Charities, our social service arm, provides resources in many, many languages: Spanish, Vietnamese, Korean, which are some of the larger immigrant groups in our area. So all our institutions have to begin to adapt to provide the resources and the need and the support for all the different and the growing diversity of our church. And then in our pews, there are many in our pews who are comfortable with this growing diversity. We have Catholics who welcome this diversity. There are Catholics who see the arrival of African immigrants, the arrival of Asian immigrants, the arrival of Latin American immigrants as an opportunity for growth for their churches. There are many parishes that are experiencing growth because of the influx of immigrants. I don't have it here, but I think if you Google, there's a very interesting map that shows the areas where the Catholic Church is growing today, and it's on the south of the United States and on the west and the western coast of the United States. And that's where most of our immigrants are going to. These are the areas where immigrants are beginning to populate. And as you can hear, the arrival of these new immigrants is causing a lot of challenges in all these areas. But one of the things that we know is that whenever there are immigrants, the parishes are flourishing, the parishes are growing. So if we begin to look at those who are arriving into our parishes, into our communities as opportunities, then we're going to be able to experience growth. One of the other things that also we know is that, unfortunately, descendants of previous waves of immigrants, particularly those coming from Europe, they appear to be the least comfortable with the diversity. So whereas in previous generations, and I think this completely makes sense, prior to the 1960s, most of the immigrants were coming from Europe with a very similar way of worshiping, though linguistically different. But the worship style and the traditions and the culture was in some ways similar. And now we have a growing diversity with people who have different feast days, different names for Mary, different celebrations, different things that are important for their lives. And so that can create, some challenges in our parishes, particularly when you have 2 or 3 groups that are sharing the same space. Let's remember that in previous years, some of these issues were avoided because the Italians worshipped with the Italians, the Polish with the Polish, the Germans with the Germans. And now we have the Vietnamese, Salvadorians, and the descendants of European immigrants all in one space, sharing, trying to make it work with this growing diversity. But what we know is, and what we've found is, folks who are of non-European descent tend to be more comfortable with this diversity. So what I'd like to do now is to take some time to have a closer look at some of these groups of immigrants. So I'd like to start with the Asian and Pacific Island, the immigrants coming from this part of the world, and particularly Catholics coming from this part of the world. What we know about Asian Pacific Islanders is that right now they're the fastest growing in terms of percentage, the fastest growing immigrant group in the United States. While only 3% of Asia's populations identifies as Catholic, the vast majority of immigrants coming from Asia are actually Christian and Catholic. So most of the immigrants who are coming from this part of the world are actually Christians and Catholic. And so while there might be other religions as well, like Buddhists and different traditions, the majority of those who are leaving their homes in Asia are actually Christian. Of the estimated 9.9 million people in the 21 major Pacific Island nations, about 2.9 million or 29% identify as Catholic. So when we look at the Pacific Islands, it's they're more likely to be Catholic than some of the other Asian groups. And one of the groups that actually stands out, that is very large and is very Catholic, are Filipinos. And Filipinos, actually, I think it's up to 90% of Filipinos who actually identify as immigrants, as Catholics, I'm sorry. And what we know also is that while the first generation, the first wave, the immigrants themselves, might set their homes in our parishes and might practice the faith, their children and their grandchildren are actually disconnected from the church and are at a higher rate leave the church than other groups. So young people who are children of immigrants are leaving the church at a faster rate than non-immigrants. So that's something that we need to consider and we need to take very seriously as well. What do we know about these Asian Catholics? Well, we know that they are very religious. The percentage of Asians who say that religion is very important in their lives is 64%, as opposed to 54% for white Americans. 6 in 10 Asian Catholics say that they attend Mass at least once a week, and that's higher than our general population. So 6 out of 10 Asians say that they attend Mass on a regular basis. 61% of Asian Americans report that they pray daily, and it's 55% for white Americans. And what we also know is that we make it problematic when we start grouping people into larger categories. Now, Asia is a very diverse continent. There's Korea, Vietnam, Bangladesh, then you have the Asian Pacific Islands like the Philippines, you have Japan, you have China. It's a very, very diverse region. And and you add the fact that we also consider part of the Middle East as Asia. So we have India and other parts and other countries in there. So when we talk about the Asian Pacific Islanders, we're encompassing a very broad and diverse population. And one of the things that we know is that the API label, or Asian Pacific Islander, can actually create some complications for us because we try to put together this broad and diverse group of Catholics. And when we begin to try to provide services and ministries, and we don't remember the distinct ethnic and national differences and cultural differences, then sometimes we begin to get into trouble, right? Because each culture wants to be respected, each nationality wants to be uplifted, and so we can't just clump them all together. So it is a challenge identifying them under the label of Asian Pacific Islanders. But at the same time, when we put them together as API, it also gives them large representation, where if they're by themselves, they become a very small percentage of the church. So it's, so that's sort of like the dance that we have with the Asian Catholic, Asian Pacific Island Catholics, the representation. But one thing that we know is that they're very devout, that they have a high respect for their ancestors and their culture and their traditions. And those are beautiful things that they contribute to the church in the United States. Now let's take a look at the immigrants from Africa. So Africans make up 36% of the foreign-born black population in the United States. So it's increased. If you look at that little graph that I have there, you can see the growth of the African immigration from the 1970s. And so in the year 2015, that number really jumped up. If you look at compared to the 1970s, it's been a significant increase. Why? Well, what's been happening in Africa? There's a lot of instability. There's a lot of poverty. And so all these things are pushing people to leave their homes. On average, African immigrants are older than other immigrant groups. And some of the African immigrants ages between 25 and older have a bachelor's degree. So one of the things that we know is that among immigrants, Africans tend to be the most educated population of all the immigrant groups. So when we think about the myths sometimes that we have of African countries and migrants from these places, knowing that they are highly educated should help us see that the myth is a myth. So let's take a closer look at these immigrants, and particularly the Catholic immigrants from Africa. So African-born Catholics, they retain a strong fidelity to the church. This is something that I've encountered in my work, particularly with some of the African communities from Ethiopia and Eritrea. They have a very strong sense of their Catholic identity. And they feel and not only follow the church's teaching, but for them to follow the precepts of the church and their traditions is very important. I'll give you one example. We have in the Archdiocese of Washington, we have Catholics from Ethiopia and Eritrea, from the Ge'ez Rite. And one of their practices is to actually fast before the liturgy. And they have to fast not just the hour that we in the Latin Rite recommend, but they actually fast for 12 hours before their Mass. So on Saturday at sundown, they begin their fast until Sunday morning when they go to Mass. After communion, after Mass is when they can break their fast. And that's something that they hold on to, and it's very important for them. We also know that Africans have a much higher attendance rate, so they participate. Again, we're talking about the immigrant groups here. And one of the biggest challenges that we have with them is that they have this outsider mentality, and a lot of times it's difficult to bring them into a sense of ownership of the church, of their parish. So one of the things that we need to do is we need to expand their comfort zone. We need to not only welcome them and make them feel that they're at home, but begin the process of giving them some sense of responsibility for the life of the church. And what we know is that when we give it to them, they will respond because of their strong faith and because of the care and the concern that they have for the church. So now let's look at the other group, the Latin Americans, immigrants from Latin America. Vast majority of them are Catholic. 55% of Hispanics, Latinos in the United States identify as Catholic. 55% is actually, there's been a drop in the affiliation of Hispanic Latinos. In 2010, 67% of Hispanic Latinos in the United States identified as Catholic. That number has dropped to 55%. So in less than 3 years, that drop happened. And what we know is it's not necessarily that the first generation, the immigrants, are the ones abandoning the church, but really it's their children. And so we have to be attentive to that. 65% of all Hispanics in the United States are of Mexican origin, and then the second largest group are Puerto Ricans, right? And Puerto Ricans are not immigrants, obviously. They fall into the category of Hispanics, so that's why we're considering them here. The other interesting thing is that the U.S. Hispanic population, so in other words, people who speak Spanish in the United States, represents the second largest concentration of in the world. So only Mexico has more Spanish speakers than the United States. So that just shows you the number and the size of the Hispanic Latino population. And we also know that Hispanics account for 71% of the growth of the Catholic Church in the United States since the 1960s. Today, 6 out of 10 Catholics under the age of 30 are of Hispanic Latino descent. And since the 1960s, it's been the influx of Hispanic Latino immigrants that has actually helped the church grow over the last few decades. The next slide, you can see, this is another way of showing some of the things that I've already said in terms of affiliation. 55% of Hispanic Latinos identify as Catholic. And again, this is a drop. The unaffiliated rate has increased tremendously among Hispanic Latinos. You can see here, this is the graph that shows in 2010, what I was saying, in 2010, 67% of Hispanics identified as Catholic, and by 2013, that number was down to 55%. Some of us think that if we were to do this poll again, that affiliation among Hispanics is probably below 50% at this point. So it's one of the conundrums that we have in the United States, one of the paradoxes, really, that we say that the church in the United States is rapidly becoming Hispanic, while Hispanics are rapidly becoming less and less Catholic. And it's because of just the size of the population that we're still able to see growth in the church. But it should be concerning to us that we are losing our young people. And then that graph can show you more of that. So let's take a closer look at this, at Catholics from Latin America and some of the pastoral challenges. Integration of Hispanics at all levels continues to be very minimal. 1 in 5 pastoral leaders who are serving Hispanic Catholics in major ministerial positions within a parish or a diocese are not compensated. So they usually tend to minister and tend to work for the church and in the church as volunteers without any compensation. A lot of times, the ministries or the services offered to Hispanic Latinos are not offered in their parishes, in their own communities. So a lot of times Hispanics have to pass 4 or 5 different churches before they get to a parish that will provide them with the Mass in Spanish. There have been a few efforts in parishes to develop programs and resources that reach out to non-traditional Hispanic Catholic populations. Who are these non-traditional Hispanic? Well, these are people on the margins. These are young people who are at risk of becoming involved in gangs. These are families that are separated, and usually we have families where one parent is here in the United States, perhaps living with the children or maybe by him or herself, and then you have the rest of the family back at home. So we have a lot of fragmented families in that sense. And we need to make a better effort as a church to reach out to these populations. Some of the other challenges that we know are that resources not only are they limited, but a lot of times they're not equally distributed. And we can think about the parishes scenario. You have to pass 5 parishes before you get to Spanish Mass. So the resources could be concentrated in one area, while the population could be dispersed, in many different geographical areas. So those are some of the challenges that we have in Hispanic Latino Catholics bring to our church. So before we move to the piece of the judge, I just want to show this one graph because it really encapsulates the diversity of the church in the United States today. So if you look by generations, here's the graphs. At the very top are millennials. And you can see the cultural and ethnic distribution of Catholics among millennials. The vast majority, over 50% of them, are of Hispanic Latino descent. And then if you move, if you go down and you look at the previous generations, you can see that they were largely white European, right? And so when we start looking at the future, we have to look at the line of millennials, because that's the area where we have to do a lot of our evangelization efforts. So it's among the young people, and our young church is a very diverse church, but it's largely a Hispanic church. And so that's the reality. That's just a snapshot, and there are many, many other things that I could have thrown your way, but this is a snapshot of the diversity, where people are coming from, and what are some of the challenges that they represent. So let's look at what our church teaches, and let's look at Scripture. So the foundation for our work with immigrants in our church really comes from the gospel. And we know that Jesus was a refugee. We know that he fled with his family into Egypt. They were fleeing persecution. And then during Jesus' ministry, we know that he didn't have a home. As a matter of fact, I think it was a couple Sundays ago where the Sunday readings was, "Teacher, where do you lay your head?" And Jesus responded, "Come and see." And then they followed him. And so Jesus did not have a home. And we also have the instructions of Jesus himself, who tells us that to welcome the stranger. And he says in Matthew 25, he says, "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. A stranger and you welcomed me." So this is the commandment of Jesus. This is the commandment of the gospel, that we have to welcome the stranger, that we have to give food to the needy and the thirsty, right? And we also know that Jesus himself was not welcomed by his own people. And one of the saddest experiences for me as a pastoral minister is to see other Catholics doing the same thing that was done to Jesus by his own people, where we don't welcome the stranger among us. So here's a little survey of some papal teachings going back to Rerum Novarum, where Pope Leo established that persons have a right to work, to survive, and to support their families, right? So right there from the get-go, Pope Leo saying people have the right to find the resources to help their families survive and to live with dignity. And building on that, Pope Pius XII and then Pope John the 23rd really expanded that, and particularly when they focused on reaffirming the rights of migrants. And it was Pope Pius XII who says that migrants have a right to a life with dignity, and therefore they have a right to migrate towards that end. Okay, and so the papal teaching has been consistent in the fact that when the circumstances are there and they are pushing people from their homes, they should be able to leave their homes, and they should be able to move to a different country, to move to a different area where they can find the fulfillment, and really where they can find not only work, not only the sustainability for their lives, but where their dignity will be respected. Pope John Paul II continues to expand on that, and he says that the migrant is a citizen. The fact that a migrant is a citizen of a particular state does not deprive him of membership to the human family, nor of the citizenship in the universal society. We belong to each other. That's what the Pope is saying. And all this talk about building walls between us is really contrary to the teaching, really contrary to the understanding that we're all citizens of heaven. Pope Benedict, when he came to the Americas, he came to the United States, he asked Americans, he asked us, those of us living in the United States, to continue to welcome the immigrant, to continue to open our doors, and to continue to offer to them what generations previously have enjoyed, this freedom, this ability to start a new life, this ability to have an education, to be able to realize their God-given potential. And finally, we can't look at papal teaching without looking at Pope Francis, who has been very outspoken on the defense of the rights of immigrants all across the world. And he tells us that the church is mother. And I think with that, he really captures what our attitude should be towards immigrants, towards people who have to leave their homes and uproot themselves and find themselves in our communities, in our spaces of worship. And he reminds us that we must have that motherly attentiveness, that motherly openness, to be able to receive them with open arms, with tenderness and closeness. So if we can summarize Catholic teaching, and these are the 5 principles of Catholic teaching on migration, is that persons have the right to find opportunities in their homeland. So nobody should leave their homeland. That's what the teaching is consistent. People have the right to find opportunities in their homeland. And then persons have the right to migrate to support themselves and their families. So if they're not able to sustain themselves, if their lives are in danger, or economically they don't have any opportunities, then persons should have the right to migrate. The Catholic teaching also says that sovereign nations have the right to control their borders. And then it goes on to say that refugees and asylum seekers should be afforded protection. So while we have the right to control our borders, while nations have the right to control their borders, Catholic teaching tells us that the human dignity and human rights of the sorry, I'm jumping to the last one, but what the teaching tells us is that while sovereign nations have the right to control their borders, they must do it with justice and with mercy. And that's what leads us into the understanding that refugees need to be afforded protection, and the human dignity and human rights of undocumented immigrants needs to be respected. So this is what Catholic teaching tells us. So we've looked at the reality. We've seen that it's complex. People come here for various reasons. People are coming from various parts of the world, bringing different values, bringing different things, traditions, languages to our church. And we've seen what the church tells us. We must welcome. We must open our spaces. We must recognize with motherly care. And we must see Jesus in the eyes of the stranger. Now, how do we do this? And I'd like to offer this from Pope Francis's message again to migrants and refugees and for this year. And I'd like to read this because I think it's very important, and then I will highlight the 4 parts that are important to us. The Pope said, "Every stranger who knocks at our door is an opportunity for an encounter with Christ, who identifies with the welcomed and rejected strangers of every age. The Lord entrusts to the church's motherly love again, every person forced to leave their homelands in search of a better future. This solidarity must be concretely expressed at every stage of the migratory experience, again, from departure through journey, through arrival and return." And the Pope tells us that our shared response can be articulated by 4 verbs: to welcome, to protect, to promote, and to integrate. So I'd like to offer these 4 verbs as our action piece. When we think about what should we be doing, what could we be doing, and how should we accompany immigrants, I'd like to offer these 4 verbs. So first, we welcome. And we have to offer our brothers and sisters safe passage. One of the unfortunate truths about people crossing, for example, crossing the border between Mexico and the United States, is the number of people who lose their lives in the attempt. Because they make this perilous journey, and many of them do not make it into the United States, or if they do, they don't make it beyond the desert, and they lose their lives. So we must be conscious that whenever we're doing our work, we have to realize that the journey for a lot of our brothers and sisters is not an easy one. A lot of people think that there's the argument, well, immigrants need to get in line. One of the things we understand is that the line is complicated, and a lot of times there are no lines, and so people look for ways to come here. And one of the things that we need to do as a church is to be able to find ways that people who want to come will be able to do it safely and legally. We need to promote the reunification of families. It's very important. We say as a church that we're pro-life, we're pro-family. And we can't, as a church, stand by and see our brothers and sisters who are separated, whose families, and in some cases, today, one of the biggest concerns particularly among undocumented immigrants, is that one day a child will go to school, and when they come back home, their mom or their dad has been detained by the Border Patrol and has been placed under removal proceedings. That separates family. That's not what we are about. Our parishes, our institutions need to offer immigrants and refugees a dignified and adequate accommodations to start a new life. So how do we do this? Well, our parishes should be places of welcome. And in our parishes, we should start programs, and in any way that we can, we need to accompany immigrants when they arrive, because they're starting, many of them starting from scratch, many of them starting without a community, without a family. And we need to be that family. We need to be standing up, and we need to be that population that welcomes them, that serves them, and that accompanies them. So we need to open our doors. We need to train our staff in our parishes and all our Catholic institutions to be sensitive to the cultural differences, not just the language, not just to be able to speak and communicate with the person, but to be able to be sensitive to the cultural differences. We need to ask questions. We can never assume, but we need to identify leaders who can help us and assist to make our immigrant brothers and sisters feel at home here in our parishes, in our communities. And we need to foster gatherings and experiences that welcome, affirm, and encourage immigrants. Let's remember that these are people who are leaving everything, who are uprooting themselves from their homes, from their friends, from their families, and who come and find and look for a home here in the United States. It makes a difference, because it made a difference for me, because I came to the United States by myself. I grew up by myself. I was raised by my godfather. And it was thanks to the church where I found a home that welcomed me, that embraced me. It's thanks to that I was able to accomplish all the things in my life that I've been able to accomplish. And so we must be places of welcome. We must be places that open their arms and say to the stranger, this is your home. This is your church. We need to protect. We need to defend and encourage others to defend the rights of immigrants. We need to educate ourselves about the push factors. We need to understand why people are leaving, so that when they come here, we're able to heal that trauma. A lot of times they're escaping violence. So imagine if you fear for your own life and the life of your family. And imagine if you're the only one who is able to escape that violence. And you make it to this country, and you know that your family is still in danger. So we must be able to put ourselves in the shoes of our immigrant brothers and sisters. And we must be able to encourage others to learn and be informed. We need to network with organizations that provide services to immigrants. And we need to encourage our community to provide assistance to immigrants. Not just welcome them and say, hey, here's the space. Hey, we want you to worship with us. But really provide assistance, help them in finding jobs. A lot of our social ministries in our parishes do a lot of great work in this area. And we need to continue to foster that. We need to promote. So we need to commit to an effort that ensures that all immigrants and refugees are empowered to achieve their potential. Again, I will go back to my own story. If it wasn't for the Catholic Church, I would not have realized my potential, because when you look at my story, when you look at my history and who I am, I could very well have been one of those young people who walks into a gang, who becomes involved in drug use, drug abuse, because of the circumstances in the community and the area where I grew up in. But none of that happened because I had a church that welcomed me, that accompanied me, and that promoted my existence and encouraged me to fulfill my potential. We need to encourage immigrants to identify their gifts. We need to promote inclusion of immigrants in all aspects of our parish life. So we need to welcome them not just by offering a mass in their language, but we need to give them opportunities to help us lead as well. And then finally, we need to integrate them. And integration does not mean assimilation. Integration means that we incorporate them with all their gifts. We incorporate immigrants with everything that they have to offer, with their culture, their language, their values, everything is brought in and integrated, and it is used to enrich the experience of everyone in our parishes and in all our institutions. And we have to foster a culture of encounter in every possible way. We have to build and increase the opportunities for intercultural exchange. So we can't just remember when I said the old models of the ethnic parishes are gone. Now we have a new model of shared parishes. But our shared parishes will not work if we don't encourage the encounter between cultures, between groups. And that's one of the things that we need to be doing. We need to integrate. So the four-pronged process: we have to welcome, we have to protect, we have to promote the immigrants, and we have to integrate them into our parishes. I think that summarizes our work, and it places a lot of responsibility on us. And every community needs to understand that the work that you do in your individual parish and your individual institution is going to be different from that of your next door neighbor, from that of the next state or the next city. So everyone has to be creative, but the four things always work. We need to welcome, we need to protect, we need to promote, and we need to integrate. I think we have some time questions. I don't know if we got any questions. I'm going to, I think I'm going to be reading that soon. All right, so we have a first question here. It says, I'm from a very diverse parish, yet all of our masses are in English. Our pastor, who ministers to people in English, Spanish, and Tagalog, doesn't want to say masses in other languages so as to prevent fracturing the community into different groups. Is he right about this? Should I try to do something to change his mind? That's a very common question, actually. There's a tendency to believe that unity means uniformity. So anytime we encounter that attitude of uniformity in the place of unity, I think we have to kind of push a little bit and say, well, I think we need to respect the cultures. In some cases, the fact that that we can't provide ministries or the mass, in this question, in other languages because the pastor doesn't know the language or they don't have the priest available to help in those particular languages. So in those cases, it's understandable that the pastor, but whenever possible, it's encouraged, I think, for me, it's been in my personal experience and in many of the places that I've worked, it's encouraged to offer the services and the ministries in the language that the people speak. I was with a parish group just this past Monday in a parish where they don't have masses in Spanish. But one of the things that the pastor has realized is that close to 50% of the middle schools in the surrounding vicinity to the parish are Hispanic children. And Father reached out to me and said, in our public schools, half of the student population is Hispanic. I assume that, we have families in our area that we haven't reached out to. What should we do? How do we reach out to them? And one of the things, I went and talked to some of the leaders in that community, and I said, a lot of times, the best welcome sign for Hispanic Latinos in our churches is a sign that says Misa en Español, Spanish Mass. That's the best way to welcome people. I think if it's possible to find priests who can help and minister in those languages, if you're able to find them, if they are available and they're willing to support, I think you should do it. I think you should do it because those things usually tend to help with the welcoming and the integration of these different immigrant groups. A lot of times, if you have only an English Mass, you will have a few people trickling in, and once you open the Spanish Mass, then you have an influx of people. Just another little anecdote of a parish here in locally. The pastor decided to start offering masses, and has been doing it once a month. And he started his first Spanish mass, expected about 50 people. Close to 300 people showed up. And some of the people that came in that first day said, "It is so great to have a Spanish mass here because I live across the street and I have to go, I have to travel like 15, 20 minutes to get to a parish. It's so great that now my parish has a mass in Spanish." So I would encourage those conversations, and I would explore the possibilities of offering masses in the language of the people. Any other? All right. Another question says, what can the church do in light of the current immigration situation to support those facing deportation? That's another great question. And it's actually something that I've been personally involved in. I think we have to do a lot of advocacy, and we have to educate our own Catholic population. And I think we have to remind our parishioners, particularly those who are not going through this as their day-to-day experience, who are not undocumented. We have to remind them that either their parents or their grandparents or somebody else also came, and at one point they were probably also persecuted for being Catholic, for being Irish, for being German and whatnot. So we have to remind ourselves of our history. And what can the church do? I think the church needs to continue to do those four things. We need to continue to welcome. We need to continue to protect. And protecting sometimes means, going out and talking to our representatives, getting on the phone, calling our representatives and letting them know that it's not right to separate families. It is not right to instill fear in communities. And we need to promote our immigrant brothers and sisters. We need to share their stories. And we also need to continue to integrate them, make them part of our communities, because once we realize how important they are to the fabric of our parish life, then it becomes easier for us to say, wait a minute, this is our brother and sister. When they continue to be a shadow, when they continue to be out in the peripheries, sometimes, we can easily just look the other way. But if they're standing next to us and they are vital parts to our parishes, I think a lot of times that urges us to action. But I think advocacy is one of the biggest things that we could be doing right now in terms of advocating for the rights of immigrants, and to be able to be ready to provide services. Like I mentioned today, sometimes you have a young person who goes off to school and then comes back home, and mother or father has been detained by the Border Patrol. So to be able to provide that young person with legal advice, psychological, counseling, spiritual counseling, I think those are a lot of things that we could be doing. And particularly with the young people, with the immigrants, one of the things that we're doing here in the Archdiocese of Washington is we actually offer these retreats for dreamers. So we create these opportunities where young people who are in this situation, the dreamers, can come together, reflect on their stories, and feel the presence of the church in their lives. So we've done this a couple times, and in these retreats, one of the things that our young people tell us is, I didn't know the church was so invested in me. Because we take the time to listen to them, we take the time to accompany them, and we take the time to go out and step outside Capitol Hill and show them our support. Now the question is, how can the church do more to promote leadership among immigrants? There are many ways. I think a lot of times the dioceses have a lot of resources that many of our parishes are unaware of. They have formation programs and different things that can train leaders. I would say one of the best places where to find new leaders is among young people, because the young people can navigate both cultures, right? And so they can be formed, and they have just more opportunities for being formed. So we have to be able to identify those, take advantage of the opportunities that the dioceses have for leadership formation and leadership development. And really, I think the most basic thing is to establish relationships with folks in the immigrant communities so that you can start identifying who are the people, who are the movers and the shakers. And once you're able to get them to be in positions of leadership within the church, then you begin to see a lot more growth. So find out who those people are that have some influence in the communities and invite them to leadership positions. But do take advantage, because a lot of times our dioceses have a lot of rich resources, not just dioceses, but organizations like the Catholic Apostolate Center have a lot of resources that can help promote leadership. And I think, is that it? All right, I think that's the last question. I really want to thank you again for joining us this afternoon. The center will have a recording of this webinar uploaded to their YouTube channel in the next week, and I will also have it linked on their webinars page. So please visit CatholicApostolatecenter.org for more information. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to have spent this hour with you and to have walked with you in this journey as we all walk with our immigrant brothers and sisters. Thank you, and God bless.